First of all, let you know that our next speaker is Tasha Joshua. She is going to be talking about the implementation of safety wearables within the retail warehouse coworker populations. And let me tell you a little bit about Tasha. Tasha Joshua is the Health and Wellbeing Leader for IKEA North America Services, LLC, where she oversees the national health and well-being approach for U.S. coworkers. Tasha has over 10 years experience in workplace well-being and partnering with large employers of various industries to design and implement data-driven well-being solutions for employees, retirees, and their families. Tasha is passionate about creating workplace cultures that promote safe environments for coworkers to practice healthy behaviors, have access to vital benefits and resources, and attain psychological safety. To achieve this, she believes that a holistic approach is necessary and that key functions must work cooperatively to achieve a healthy workplace and culture. Thank you, Tasha, for sharing your thoughts with us today, and you have the floor.
All right. So today, as was mentioned, I'm going to talk about implementation of safety wearables within retail warehouse coworker populations. I am the Health and Wellbeing Leader at IKEA in the US, and we'll get started. So what we will discuss today, we'll discuss ergonomic safety wearables and the pilot that we completed recently in the US and in Canada. I'll talk mostly about the US. We'll talk about basic research on benefits and effectiveness of ergonomic safety wearables. We'll talk about our implementation plan here in the US, the barriers for implementation, but also the strategies for implementation, and then I'll wrap it up with lessons learned. So I want to start off just talking a little bit about IKEA. It's important for me when I'm talking, especially externally, to mention our culture and our values, because we do have a unique culture. Our mission is to create a better everyday life for the many people. We have about 51 standard size stores in the US with eight distribution centers and close to 18,000 coworkers in the US. We're a diverse group of people that have a strong set of values that create our culture, and we are coworker centered at IKEA. And the values for IKEA are at the bottom of your screen in those blue boxes, but you will see that they are unique and they're very coworker focused. And these are the values that we use to make decisions around everything we do at IKEA. And it's important to note that so you can kind of understand a little bit more about IKEA. And then, of course, just reminding people that IKEA is committed to creating an environment that allows and encourages our coworkers to be themselves. We offer a safe place to work, free from bullying and harassment, like many other workplaces, but these are things we really strongly stand by. We offer support and resources for coworkers facing life and health challenges, and we do this through our culture and our values. So, safety wearables. Many of you have heard of safety wearables. We've talked about safety wearables for the last, or different tracking and monitoring devices, but one of the technologies that may have come up over the last 2 days are safety wearables. We decided to use the Starter Coach, and it offers a proactive approach to injury. It works with the coworker the first day, uses AI technologies to learn the coworker movements and alerts the coworker in real time after the first shift. So the coworker wears it the first shift, gets no notifications. The second shift on, the coworker gets alerts in real time. And these alerts include a vibration and a beep, both a vibration and a beep, or a series of beeps and vibrations that alerts the coworker of the hazardous movement. Again, it's real-time feedback so that coworkers can self-correct. And the 5 movements that this device measures or tracks is low intensity lifting, twisting, long awkward static posture, high intensity lifting, and repetition. You have 2 pictures of the device on the one side of your screen. So you'll see in the picture is the armband is for the shoulder program, and then the device on the back of the safety vest is for the spine program. The safety wearables that we decided, again, is Solder Analytics, but we use, it comes in combination with not just a device, but a hub where you charge the devices, but you also get a tablet where coworkers check the device in, check it out. The cool part, or the nice part about this, is that coworkers are able to see their results and get micro learnings from this hub. So the tablet actually, at the end of the shift, the coworker checks the tablet in or checks the device in, and they get to see on the screen, very similar to what you see on your screen, progress. So if they're in day 1 out of 14 for our pilot, we did 14 days. They will know which day they're on, so they can track how long they've been wearing the device. They can see where they've improved, but what also they need to work on, and how many beeps and hazardous movements they've had that day and throughout the week, so they can actually see their progress over time. They get tips on how to improve their progress as well. And then, not on this screen, but they actually get to provide feedback. So they check it in, get their results and how they're progressing throughout the pilot, but then they get to provide feedback very simply with a happy, neutral, and sad face. Very on brand for IKEA, right? But they get to pick very simply which face is their feedback for the day. And then they can also select if pre-designed text, pre-written text, what correlates with how they're feeling. So it can be, I don't understand why we're using these devices, or I think this is helping me meet my goals, different things like that. So as far as effectiveness of the particular safety wearables we used, we did see, or the vendor, the provider of the safety wearable, Sauder Analytics, did find that continued use of these devices did result in an average of 33% reduction over industries of hazardous movements. So you'll see retail towards the bottom of your screen. I'll put on my little laser. So retail here, and then warehousing here, which are both included in the pilot that we did. And then also the vendor created a benchmark, or held a benchmark study that showed that improvements in hazardous movements were maintained 6 to 9 months after rollout. And the device is designed so that the coworker does not have to wear it continuously, but the recommendation at the time of our launch of our pilot was 10 to 21 days. And they found that after 10 to 21 days of wearing the device, the coworker maintained those improvements for 6 to 9 months after. So what we did in the US, well, we launched the pilot with Canada, but I'm focusing again on the US. So what we did in the US and in Canada in this case was design a safety wearable pilot with the purpose of exploring if wearables would improve our coworkers' ergonomics in our retail and fulfillment environments. We also looked at if these safety wearables would enhance our coworker movement awareness. How could they be more aware of how they're moving and make real-time adjustments? And then, of course, the possibility of the device decreasing injury rates, musculoskeletal injury rates to be specific, over time. But to be realistic, our pilot was 3 months. So we wanted to just explore that possibility. For the US, we pilot this program in 2 locations, our Perryville Distribution Center, and that's all. We opened this pilot up to all coworkers in the warehouse. We did ask that coworkers that drove a forklift majority of the day that were seated did not participate because the device was not going to be very beneficial to them. And then also in our Burbank store for our replenishment coworkers. And these coworkers are the coworkers that restock the shelves in our market hall and in our showroom. So putting the product back on stock so that customers can come and pick it up the next at the start of the opening of the store. Again, our pilot was 3 months. We did a 14-day rotation. So the coworker was asked to wear the device for 14 days. And we used 2 programs. The spine program, like I mentioned, the device is worn on the back of your safety vest. The coworkers were asked to participate in the spine program, but also the shoulder program where the device is worn on the bicep. So coworkers could participate twice, and essentially 14 days for the spine and 14 days for the shoulder over the course of 3 months. And then measurements of success is included participation rates, improvement rates of at least 30%, and that's improvement rates of hazardous movements, and then coworker feedback. I'll discuss a few of the roles that we had within the project. So role of our project owners, that included me as health and wellbeing leader, and then also our central fulfillment operations manager. So both of us are located in our headquarters. So we are not in either one of the sites that were part of the pilot. We maintain the direct relationship with the vendor so that we're asking questions, we're problem solving, we're doing the logistics of the pilot. We're responsible for overall pilot, but we're also designing the communication with the vendor to make sure it's appropriate for our locations. We also worked with our procurement, legal, data privacy, and our data ethics team to make sure that everything we did within this pilot was appropriate for not just IKEA, but also our local restrictions and laws, but also our entire global policies. Because the goal of this project was to see how it worked and hopefully implement in other countries. We provided utilization data for our site management and also our global partners, including the final reports, to make sure that we were on task, but also to give our thoughts and wrap up the project to recommend or not to recommend to continue. The other two stakeholders, or the two groups of stakeholders in this project, included our site owners. Those were our leaders and managers within the site. They volunteered for this position or were appointed by upper management. They provided details on the pilot and the device for those in the locations. They had early access to the device, so the idea was for them to be able to wear the device early, to role model, and to provide support for coworkers during the implementation of the project. And what we saw with this was very different in both of our units. As you can imagine, a retail store versus a distribution center. So in our retail store in California, our site owners in this case were our leaders and our manager for our goods flow team, our replenishment team. And they work side by side with the coworkers. In this role, they are on a timed basis, and the manager and leaders do need to sometimes step in and work side by side in order to get the work done before the store opens. So it provided a really good support for our project in the sense that the managers and leaders were really role modeling how to wear the device. They created buy-in with that. Whereas in our distribution center, our site owners were actually the shift managers that are not on the floor and usually doing things behind a desk, talking to coworkers, but not actually picking products or moving boxes or anything like that. They did not role model. And I think that does create a different way to promote and recruit coworkers in the project. Our coworkers were the other stakeholders in this, and they're recruited on a voluntary basis. They were asked to wear the device during the shifts they worked during those 14 days. They were given random QR codes to maintain our anonymous status, because we did decide to not track the individual that participated, but just to track them by a QR code. So we do not know who participated in this pilot, and I'll talk about the challenges that came with that. So implementation barriers. The next two slides will cover implementation barriers that we found throughout this project. And one of the things was policies and regulations, right? Like data privacy. How do we maintain good data privacy so that we're meeting all of our processes within IKEA and our policies, but also respecting the coworker? So we decided to make the whole project anonymous so that we're not associating any coworker's name or coworker ID with this information that we were tracking. We decided to make participation compensable, of course, and by doing that, we made sure that our hubs where the devices were stored were put in places that you would have to clock in to access. So that's in offices where coworkers had to come and get other materials for their daily jobs before they got into the floor, but after they clock in. And then voluntary versus mandatory participation. This was something we really thought about. And because we really wanted this to feel like an act, like we're giving coworkers more tools and resource and not something that they're being told to do again, just adding more work, we did decide to make it voluntary, and that coworkers that want to participate could participate, but they could also opt out at any time. So if they did not want to continue to wear the device for the 14 days, they had that privilege to do so, or that choice to do so. And then relative priorities, if you've ever worked with or worked in a retail setting, you know that KPIs are very important. So key performance indicators are very important. And there's always competing KPIs within a retail unit. And we didn't have a KPI established or any KPIs established for safety wearables. We did have success goals, but we didn't have key performance indicators where the units would be getting dinged or having to meet goals on their own. Other communication barriers included communication. In these two settings, the coworkers do have limited access to computers during their shifts. They are not sitting in front of a computer to perform their job. They do have access, but it is off the warehouse floor. And a lot of times this access is limited. So we had to think about, how do we communicate with coworkers when they're not getting emails, they're not being able to read articles. So we made sure we communicated and provided customized communication to our leaders and our managers. So communications really came from postings within the unit and leaders. Another implementation barrier was knowledge and beliefs. And that's from the coworker side, but also the management side. So do coworkers that are using a device, understand the privacy that they have when using the device? Do they understand how the data is being used? Do they understand what's being tracked? And also, how are we communicating those things? Because this can make and break our project. We also had to acknowledge that not all coworkers will have the same value on ergonomics. Not all leaders will have the same value on ergonomics. So it may not be as important. They may not communicate it the same way, or they may not be willing to volunteer to participate in this project. Implementation strategies that helped with these barriers or helped us kind of negate some of these barriers included a formal implementation plan. So we established a timeline and plan. As project owners, we customized communication packets so that the communication assets were really easy to understand, that you could literally walk by and understand it within a few seconds, because we knew that they would be posted on the wall or posted on computer screens where coworkers may not stop and have a chance to read it. In places that the posters were, in places that coworkers had more time to digest the information, we did add a little bit more information. So maybe in the break room, in the bathrooms, the posters had more wording. And then we made sure we had presentations and videos that the site owners could share during the start of the shift. They talked about it during their pre-shift warm-up. So as coworkers are stretching and getting daily alerts or news and KPI information, they're also getting information from the site owners about this pilot. So we really tried to customize the communication so that it went with our units and how they were able to pick up the information. We also decided 14 days was part of the customization. Our Canadian counterparts did it for 10 days, but we thought 14 days would be an easier way to understand. It's 2 weeks, you wear the device for 2 weeks, you then take it off and the next group of people wear the device. And then when another strategy we used was trialability. We piloted in two US locations along with 2 Canadian locations, and we tried to work with different departments. So in the US, we did goods flow or replenishment in our retail store, and then our distribution center, which services our stores and our customers, which is unique in the sense that it's a bigger distribution center and it's not the same type of work environment that the Canadian pilot was in. Exactly, not the exact same, but very similar. Another strategy we used were champions. So coworkers that are eligible to participate would also be spokespersons for the pilot. They would promote the wearables. They would educate the coworker on the purpose of the pilot and hope dispel some of those myths that coworkers may have around how the data is being used, why they should wear it, things like that. When it comes to participation, so at the end of the pilot, these are some of the results as far as participation, and I'll talk about coworker feedback too. But we in the US had an average session, aware session of 6.3. So on average, our coworkers wore the device for 6.3 shifts, compared to an industry benchmark of 6.6, so pretty close. In our Burbank store, we saw a 5.8 shift average, and then our Perryville distribution center, we saw 6.7. I do want to point out that the way these two sites operated did have something to do with that. So in our Burbank store, we have smaller population for our test pilot. It was about 30 coworkers in the replenishment goods flow department that were able to participate, and the site owners did have a list of volunteers or a group of volunteers that would participate for the first 14 days. At the end of those 14 days, they shifted to the next group, and coworkers wouldn't. It made it harder for coworkers to wear the device for longer than 14 days because of that method. In Perryville, they asked the coworkers to participate at will. So coworkers could wear the device for 14 days, starting on any day that they choose. And as you can see, we did have a few coworkers, very few, that wore the device all the way past, I think it's 28 days. It's a little hard to see, but 28 days. So that does skew some of our average session times. Coworker feedback. As I mentioned, coworkers, when they turn the device in, they check the device in at the end of the shift, they had the opportunity to pick the happy, neutral, or sad phase. Here's the results. But I want to point out that this is all the feedback we received over the 3 months. So it does not designate when coworkers, at what point in their wearing of the device, so day 1 versus day 14, what input they gave. And what I found from verbal feedback was that the first few days, coworkers were more likely to be confused on what the beeps meant, even though we gave them information and they worked with their manager or leader to understand. And by wearing the device a few days, their outlook really changed on the device, on how they felt about the device. But we did also do not only that feedback, but we did surveys, anonymous surveys that were written out so coworkers can write anything they wanted and shared if they thought the device was helpful. And we did find large majority, almost everyone felt that the device helped them become more aware of their hazardous movements and influence change in their behavior and movement. So coworkers really felt that this device helped them improve their ergonomics. We had limited negative feedback, but we did get feedback on the alerts. Coworkers found them to be a bad part of the pilot, but I'm going to quote them and saying that it was very annoying. That was the term that most coworkers used, because there was no choice to stop the vibrations or stop the beeps. You had to have beeps and vibration. And that was a little distracting from what they said, but very annoying. And lessons learned. So the next 2 slides, I'm wrapping up with lessons learned. While doing the anonymous feature, we really think helped coworkers feel more comfortable with wearing the device, we also felt that it created barriers for discussing and reaching out to coworkers when they had continued hazardous movements, and we couldn't go and coach them into creating safer ways of working. So we really weren't sure which coworker was who when we looked at the data. So we couldn't go and individually talk to our coworkers around moving in a safer way. The sites that lacked the leadership support really had an impact on their participation level. So leadership support at the site level was super important. And then coworkers questioned the validity of the device because they felt that they were getting false negatives. So if they were eating lunch, the device might have vibrated or beeped, but they hadn't did a hazardous movement. So they kind of questioned if this device was as valid as we said it was. And then coworker involvement in device selection is something we didn't include. And I really think that would have helped us understand how coworkers saw the device prior to implementation. We also could have worked on recruitment of coworker champions. That was something, while we had it in as a as a strategy, it did not come out and play exactly how we planned it. And then sites that included the device wearing as new hire orientation really saw improvement in participation. Getting coworkers that were new to wear the device was much easier than getting coworkers that were longer tenured. And then sites didn't have as much ownership because they didn't have the project owners on site. So how can we change that for the future if we roll it out on a larger scale to have our sites have more ownership in this pilot or in this project? And then the last thing on here is something that I personally am thinking about. How do we measure success? Is it participation percentage? How many people participate? Is it the hazardous movement reduction? And in combination with how many sessions coworkers wear the device, because we know that they do have to wear the device for a certain amount of sessions to actually maintain that hazardous movement. So we have a lot of coworkers wear the device a few times, but they don't get to that minimum number. Are we even seeing the results long term? So how do we really measure success for long term is something that we need to kind of think about. And then that's it. Thank you. And in Swedish.
Thank you so much, Tasha. There is so much to talk about and think about with this example program that you put in place. And sharing this with us really allows us to get in deep with respect to what are the points of failure, and more important, what are points of success as we learn from this example. First of all, congratulations on getting the organization to actually do this pilot.
Thank you.
That is very important. And, you know, any kind of intervention that keeps coworkers healthier and work in a healthier way obviously is a plus for the owners of the business, and it was a good attempt. And I think what you've laid out in terms of what were the barriers to implementation and potential loss of opportunity for people to learn from this and integrate this into changed movement after being trained, so to speak, in terms of understanding what movements were risky and which ones were not. This is all really valuable. So let me ask some questions and investigate this a little bit further. One of our participants, Lisa Baum, is asking, as an alternative to the wearables, what engineering controls does IKEA have in place to prevent ergonomic injuries? Are there any engineering controls in place?
So I'm pretty sure there are, and that will be more on our safety and security occupational health team. So while they're not on the call, they did partner with me in the sense that, sorry, I think I'm trying to share again, in the sense that we worked well together in consultant. They were not, I can't answer all those questions because I don't have the answer, sorry.
Sure. So, but what's interesting about what you just said is that you do have other people within IKEA who are working on the same problem.
Yes.
And that brings up the question in terms of partnering with all of the parties at IKEA who have a part in the overall goal of keeping coworkers healthier and safer and free from hazards and harms. So it's just really important here to figure out what's the combination that's going to really make a difference. So one other participant is asking, were you able to get any feedback from coworkers who declined to participate about what their hesitations were?
So while we didn't survey them, but on site while I was there, I did ask, are you participating? Tell me your concerns. And it was a lot about, it's not going to help, or I don't understand it. What is it tracking? And even with the education there with me saying, I can explain it to you. They weren't interested, and that's okay because it was voluntary, and we do want to respect that, opinion. And I do think the more people wore the device, the more they talked about it, and more coworkers were able to understand and then participate. I did have a few coworkers that said, oh, I didn't understand it was that simple, because it's literally putting the device on your shirt, doing your shift, right? So that kind of information really helped them either change their mind by just understanding it's more simple, or getting more feedback from their fellow coworkers that have used the device.
Did you have a feeling that for the pilot, not having the opportunity to talk about the work design and what are the problems and risks associated with those kinds of jobs that you're trying to protect them from? Was there, it sounds like you didn't have much opportunity to kind of set up the rationale for why this is an important thing to track and measure, and therefore help people understand themselves. What are the health risks?
Yeah, so there was limited opportunity, but we did include that in our presentation. So especially for our distribution center, when they do their pre-shift meeting, they have these huge screens, and the site manager would come out and talk about why this is important. But I also question, are those the best ways to talk about it, right? When you have a large crowd of people, 2 screens, and they're coming to work. Do we do this beforehand? When do we provide that education? Do we do it as a warm up to the pilot? Things like that, not when the pilot is kicking off, right?
Mm. And when people have already pre-selected themselves to be part of the pilot as a volunteer versus what you may have needed to do for those who didn't volunteer, but you really want them in the sample. So can we delve a little bit into the hesitancy and the lack of involvement of shift managers and the leadership in helping you make this pilot more compelling for the participants? Because one thing that continues to be an impediment to successful interventions is that operations and management have one goal. You have a different goal to accomplish, and they seem to be disconnected. So can you talk a little bit about what you think might win over operations and shift managers and plant managers? What can we do that you think might make this more possible, if you can?
I think there are plenty of things you can do. I do believe that the shift managers, the unit managers, all of upper management understands the importance of safety. I do think they have competing priorities. And how do you bring that to the top, right? Is it make it mandatory that the unit participates? Is it set a KPI for it? I think it really depends on the culture of your organization and what works best. So one thing we're doing is suggesting that it's part of a new hire orientation, because that seemed to work with our shifts and with our distribution center. And it creates a great way to start your career journey with IKEA. You're starting off with learning how to best move, and then do it as maybe continued learning every few years or every year. So that's what we're thinking as far as moving forward. We're not sure how we're going to move forward yet. We're still evaluating, but there's plenty of opportunities to encourage your site unit and your site and unit managers to really get into this a little bit more.
I think your suggestion for making it part of the new hire orientation actually gets people going in the right direction right at the beginning. And it also brings up the question, which really doesn't get much play, which is hiring people into those positions who have already high safety awareness and appreciation of safety measures. This is something that I was part of for a Toyota assembly plant. That one of the the hurdles that applicants had to go through was to pass a safety awareness test and an appreciation for safety measures, because auto plants are very challenging with respect to injuries and illness. So is there any appetite for thinking through how people are brought into the organization, into these jobs, so that they're more inclined to be interested in working safely as opposed to quickly and hazardously?
Well, we have safety standards, right? So that should help create that culture. And our sites are very safety focused. And I think we set such a high standard on our culture that it helps keep people doing the right thing, doing the IKEA way. It's hard to deviate from what everyone else is doing to be that person that's not being safe. We have ways to keep people safe. We have regulations like everyone else, but it's very important. We even have a physical therapist at one of our sites that was in the pilot, but because we didn't have coworker information tied to hazardous movements, it made it hard for us to follow up with those coworkers.
So a last question is, when you have a system like the wearables that beep when you do things wrong, what we know from operant conditioning is that you can, if people care about that beeping and find it noxious enough, they will stop that hazardous behavior. However, it's not paired with some pleasurable or positive reinforcement for people doing things in a healthy and less hazardous way. So they only got one side of the equation instead of both sides of the equation. Do you think that might have helped with the acceptance of this implementation and maybe longer term wearing of this device?
I think it would have, even recognition from their manager that they're improved, things like that really I think would have helped. But again, it was anonymous, so that took away some of that ability to do that.
Yeah, so all I can say is excellent presentation on a pilot study that's very difficult to implement under the circumstances that you had. And it's admirable that you stuck through it, and you've recognized so many things that can be added to the pilot to make it successful next time, and also to convince management and leadership that this is a valuable activity to engage in. So I really appreciate your, yes.